Now to the evening's event. I first met Mike in 1947 when... Sorry, that does when he and his parents moved into the house that Peter and I now live in. And Mike and I have been best friends ever since. I won't bore you with how as kids we negotiated stringing tin cans between our bedroom windows. I'll move right along to tell you about Mike now. He graduated from Gloucester High, Amherst College, Boston University, and Harvard Law School. He joined the faculty of Harvard Business School in 1993 and was awarded an endowed chair in 2001. Mike wrapped up his full-time teaching this past semester, but will continue to be active in executive programs and online learning. He has authored or co-authored 11 books, written articles for journals such as The Atlantic Monthly and the New York Times, and sits on several international steering committees and advisory boards for dispute resolution and consensus building. There's a great deal more on this extremely impressive CV, but it does not state what I think is the most important thing you need to know about Mike. Mike is a Gloucester guy, and he has a big heart.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. I see Woody sitting in the second row, worried about how the standards at his alma mater have just sunk to rock bottom, that I should have such tenure there. And next to him is Hopi, who does some very important work in dispute resolution on a community basis. So in some ways, I think there are people in this room who can speak with a great deal of wisdom about negotiation. Let me describe what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. This is a book talk, supposedly, and the book in question is The Art of Negotiation, Improvising Agreement in a Chaotic World. I wrote that several years ago, and it's a contrarian book. A lot of people in my field would say, I hope Mike gets better very soon. And I'll explain what it's contrary to and describe to you ways in which I think we can learn about negotiation in terms of understanding it, and also manage negotiation in the sense of doing it by going afield. So we'll talk briefly about what those of us who aren't musical nevertheless can learn from Wynton Marsalis, can learn from medical practice, can learn from General Eisenhower. So that's in the book, but I've literally turned the page on that. This past February, we launched an online course on the HBX platform. So I've gotten into digital learning, and you'll see a few videos of interesting negotiators who have points of view that I think are complementary. I don't know that we'll have time for it, but I'll also describe other ways in which I've left paper and moved to an electronic environment in the app that I've developed. You have, and I'm glad you're all ready, Holly, with your pen and so forth. You have in front of you a form. It may or may not be easy to fill out, but I want to get some sense of you in the room, many of whom I know, but we haven't necessarily talked negotiation. So I have a question. If you had to choose one of those options, loving to negotiate, liking it, being indifferent one way or the other, disliking it or hating it, what's your first impulse? And I'm not going to cold call people. I'm not going to ask you to explain your point of view. But my hunch is there's not going to be a unanimous answer here. So that's question number one. Don't give it too much thought. You got it there, right? Okay, good. So people may quibble whether I'm asking for a metaphor or an analogy. Bobby Burns, I think, right, said, my love is like a red, red rose. So what first comes to mind when I say negotiation is like? Write down a word or a phrase that captures negotiation. Finally, this is a little more difficult. On the flip side, you'll see a quiz, and this is going to take you a little time to think about, but maybe you're terrific at negotiating, but there's one thing in particular even more spectacularly effective. Or maybe you think you're terrible at all these things, but there's one thing you're not quite so bad at. And the things are, from the top, recognizing opportunities to create value, asserting your interests, understanding others, and getting the maximum possible. I'm asking you to allocate 16 points. So this is also a math test to see whether you can put down 4 digits and it'll be 16. And obviously, if you're better at one thing, then you've got to take some points away in another place. Now, we'll come back to this towards the end, and I'll show you how just getting a foothold in learning to negotiate and being reflective about what you do, how this very simple diagram that will develop from it, and I'll explain how to fill out the matrix later on, how that can give you an imperfect reflection, but a reflection nonetheless about the balance of very important skills. Let's start with the metaphors, though, for a moment. I've asked truly thousands of people this question: what's your metaphor for negotiation? And they fall into 3 clusters. Marriage doesn't have to happen, but compromise and finding a ZOPA, a zone of possible agreement, can add value to both parties. A happy marriage. Building a bridge between 2 shores. Some of you might have said that, I don't know. Ballet of logic. Maybe you say, that's not the way I see it. How about the second model? Very different view of negotiation. We're going to talk about mindset here and what people bring to the table, because it not only reflects your understanding of negotiation, but it shapes what you do and how you see others. I love the last one. I mean, that's not a Thanksgiving dinner I want to be at. Then something that's different from it, and I must say I am closer to this model. A dance, partners with different styles and tastes trying to achieve harmony. Jazz, we're going to talk about that, each kind of responding to the other. I heard another version of the dancing in the darkness. Somebody said it's like dancing in the pitch dark on a tabletop, right? You're trying to find your way through it. So I said I won't call, but I'm confident that there are some people who are sort of category 1, some who are category 3, some maybe whom you don't want to see at Thanksgiving with the long knives out. What I want to talk about here is going beyond just knowing about negotiation. That's important. It gives you a framework for understanding it, whether you're trying to understand what other people have done, what's going on in the public sphere or in business. That's important. It is necessary to be an effective negotiator, but it's not sufficient. I think people get better through practice, provided that it is reflective. But finally, I've really come to believe that we don't park our temperaments, we don't park our values at the door when we go to negotiate. It is a fundamentally social activity. So we have to decide what, if anything, we owe other people in the way of fairness, or for that matter, what fairness is. What we owe them in terms of candor, if anything, and why. And what about the use of pressure tactics? People tend to flatter themselves. This is sort of a Lake Wobegon effect. Great majority of people think they're more ethical than the average person, which is, of course, mathematically impossible to pull off. We all can be guilty of that. So with that as background, I just wanted to understand that we're talking about mindset here, the attitudes we bring to negotiation. Some people are very positive about it. That on the left is my former student, Erin Egan, who works for Microsoft now. She previously worked for Airbus. Erin went to Lewis and Clark. She's a Northwest person, very nuts and berries. She loves to negotiate. And she tells me these horror stories of internal negotiations at Microsoft and all this infighting and so forth. She loves it. She thinks it's drama, it's interesting. What can you do to right the ship? I want to show you a clip where she describes being very young, going to negotiations between Airbus and GE engine builders for their planes. And it's not just about technology, it's about money. The financing in those deals is very complicated. And here is Erin describing what she was doing in her early 20s.
I mean, the vantage point I had when I was at Airbus is that I was not the lead negotiator. I was really a very junior person in the room. And so I had the luxury to be very observant. What's interesting is what's not said and body language. And you can learn a lot, especially if it's a team. When someone on the team says something, watching how other people on their own team respond, that's extremely telling. You can understand if everybody's aligned. Because in a negotiation, this is very important, especially when you're with large corporations. There are, like I've said, there's so many people with so many different opinions that you need to figure out whose opinion matters and who's actually able to get something done, and if they have a quorum within their own team. And a lot of times they don't. So what I used to do is say, I think that they said this, but I don't think it's entirely true. Or I don't think the technology's ready. I think they're telling us it is, but I don't think it is. And they'd be like, why? Like, where do you come up with that? I'm like, well, because when the engineer said something, the other person looked at him like he was crazy. Or when the other guy shifted in his chair, very uncomfortable. And why would he do that if that was true?
So she loves watching these dramas and taking part in them. She basically has her own portfolio in Microsoft. She buys companies and technologies and so forth, partners and so forth. There are a lot of people who don't have her enthusiasm for it. Many of you may know the book Getting to Yes, written by my friends and colleagues, the late Roger Fisher, Bill Urey, and Bruce Patton. It is identified as a win-win negotiation approach, though that phrase never appears in it. But the notion is that we're going to find ways to accommodate differing priorities, make gains from trade. We're going to be reasonable and objective, and the idea is to expand the pie. Then you've got on your slide there, somebody figured out, interesting, the jacket design, Chris, is not accidental here, same sort of thing, but a big black no. This is Jim Camp. This is the Bible of hard bargaining. You go to a negotiation and somebody says, would you like a lemonade? And you say no, or throw it in their face. Now, these are very different schools of thought. If you will, this is metaphor 1, this is metaphor 2. But I've come to think that they both share some common faults. One is that they believe one size fits all. I don't buy it. This is the epigram in my book. I think negotiation is a very complex process, even if it's in a simple transaction like buying a car, in terms of its dynamic, and one person is influencing the other in ways that may be intended or otherwise. It also doesn't cope with the fact that our hands aren't the only ones on the wheel. The bus is being driven by somebody else as well, who may have a very different view of what's at stake, what standards ought to be applied, and by the way, your hands may get stronger or worse as time passes on. Most important, you may learn some things. Some things you thought you want may in fact not be so important. Other things you might have overlooked loom large. And as a consequence, I've come to the view that it is an act of improvisation that allows us to get to an agreement. We're also operating with incomplete information. You may know the person you're dealing with. Are they having a good day or a bad day? Are they operating under some constraints that weren't existing in the past? If it's a stranger, is this going to be a friendly or a hard encounter? And so on and so on. So I've come to see negotiation as a process where we're constantly updating. We're learning about the environment. Is there a good chance or not such a good chance for agreement? We're learning about the other person. We're trying to gauge their impressions of us. We're adapting to them where we have to. We're trying to influence them where we can. And this is critical, it's taking place in a strategic environment. If I make a demand, hoping the other side will accede to it, maybe I'll get a yes, or maybe I'll back them to a corner where they feel that they have no alternative but to fight back. Let me give you an example of what I mean by improvising. I've changed the names here, but a friend of mine who was a colleague many years ago had a leave of absence from school for a year, and he was working for a small investment fund where, this is the late 1980s, the capital had come from real estate development. The person who founded the firm had done very well, and they were diversifying their investments. They bought a small cable television system in the Midwest for $8 million. Some of it was their monies, some of it was leveraged. They wanted to put a toe in the water. Now, maybe they were smart, maybe they were lucky, but it proved to be a very good investment. So now the question was, how do we grow? Let's get some adjoining systems. We'll have economies of scale and so forth. And they approached Max, who had owned the adjoining system, figured that they could spend $11, maybe $12 million for that system. And they went back and forth for several months. And finally, Max said, "You're talking money that doesn't tempt me at all. If you were to put $15 million in small unmarked bills in a paper bag, you'd give me a problem. I would give serious consideration to taking it, and if I took it, I'd probably kick myself. You're millions away from what this is worth." Now, getting to yes, you could try all kinds of smoke and mirrors and so forth, but this is a difference in valuation that is non-trivial. You could start with no and dig yourself in a corner, you don't have a deal. But when Max said that, Jay asked one question, and 10 minutes later they were shaking hands on a deal. The question was this: if you think your system is worth $15 million, how much do you think our system is worth? And Max paused and said, well, it's a little smaller, maybe 14 and a half. So this is strategic agility. Jay went in being very bullish on cable. He was dealing with somebody who was rabid. And in something like 18 months, they flipped this investment. As I said, they'd paid $8, but not all of that was theirs. They made a terrific return on this. And what's interesting is the person on the other side of the table, it never occurred to them that he might be a buyer and not a seller. So this comes naturally to my friend Jay, but not necessarily to others. Until very recently, you wouldn't have found much about improvising in negotiation literature, or for that matter, with some exceptions, in strategy more generally. So I've looked to other fields, and I note some in the shaded text that we're not going to get into here: complexity theory, improv, and so forth. But I want to just make some quick references to jazz, military strategy, medicine. How many people here have taken a musical lesson sometimes in their life? Yeah, well, you didn't see my hand go up, right? I have not. I hope to be able to raise my hand by the end of the summer. But here's Richard Holbrooke, very controversial diplomat, a piece of work, as they said. There's something called the program of negotiation, which is Harvard, MIT, and Tufts, John, Jess Sellecuse is actively involved in it. And we give a Great Negotiator Award, but we don't just give a trophy. We have day-long seminars, presentations, and so forth. And unprompted by me, Holbrook compared negotiation to jazz. You know where you want to go. You don't know how you'll get there. It's nonlinear. So it's interesting how he appropriates jazz. Here's Wynton Marsalis talking about things the other way around.
The real power of jazz and the innovation of jazz is that a group of people can come together and create art, improvised art, and can negotiate their agendas with each other. And that negotiation is the art. Like you'll hear all the time when Bach improvised, and he did improvise, but he wasn't gonna look at the second viola and say, okay, let's play Ein Feisty Berg. They were not gonna do that. Whereas in jazz, I could get together, I could go to Milwaukee tomorrow, and it'd be 3 musicians. I walk in a bar at 2:30 in the morning and say, what you wanna play, man? Let's play some blues. Well, all 4 of us are gonna start playing. And I might say, do-do-do-lee-do, and they'll say, everybody will just start comping and playing and listening, and the bass, you never know what they're gonna do. So that's our art. The 4 of us can now have a dialogue. We can have a conversation. We can speak to each other in the language of music.
So I've just highlighted the negotiation terminology. Again, this is off the top of his head. He sees negotiation as the heart of jazz. It's a way of having a dialogue, a call and response. And I might add, from what I've learned about jazz, some people are very tight, very friendly. Other people take separate cabs, and yet they can play effectively together. I have a colleague, Frank Barrett, who was here a couple of weeks ago, teaches at the Naval Postgraduate School, Organizational Behavior. He also played in the Tommy Dorsey Band, great pianist. And he has written a book called Yes to the Mess, looking broadly at what managers can learn from jazz practices. I want to point to 3 here that apply to negotiations spot on. One is what I call paying heed, much deeper than active listening. 2, having a willingness to shake things up. And 3, having a structure, this is in the spirit of Holbrook, but willing to riff off it. So another example, it's the mid-1980s. George Schultz is still alive. He's 85 years old, actually 95 years old. In his memoirs, he describes going to the Reykjavik summit between the US and the still extant Soviet Union. He was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. When they got there, they found somebody who was in the Soviet delegation who had not been expected. We knew who he was, Sergei Akrameyev. He was equivalent to the head of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. But he was at this meeting, and they didn't have a briefing book on it. So this is Schultz in his memoirs. He wanted to get some measure of Akrameyev, and he arranged a private conversation with him. And in the course of the conversation, remember we're talking about paying heed, Akrameyev said, "Mr. Secretary, you must understand I'm one of the last of the Mohegans." So Schultz said, "Last of the Mohegans, what do you mean by that?" And Akrameyev said, "Well, I'm still in uniform, but many of the people I fought with in World War II, long since dead or at least retired, and I'm still at it." But Schultz, listening deeply, said, "But last of the Mohegans, how do you know that?" And Akrameyev said, "Oh, when I was young, I read all of the books of James Fenimore Cooper." And they developed a deep personal relationship. There was talk of a massive reduction in nuclear weapons at that. It didn't happen. But when the wall came down, the relationship between Akrameyev and Schultz was very, very important, all picked up on that small, seemingly offhand remark. Or maybe it was a gesture looking to see how it would be picked up. Here's Chris Voss. It's a piece of work. He's in, as Aaron is, in my online negotiation course. Chris is a former FBI hostage negotiator. He was on a FBI SWAT team, and he blew out his knee, his ACL, and he decided he wanted to be a hostage negotiator, and he went to the head of the FBI hostage department, a woman, and said, I'd like to do this. And she said, have you ever taken a negotiation course? Chris said, no. Ever taken a psychology course? No. And she said, get lost. Chris, being Chris, said, what do I need to do to get your attention? And the person said, volunteer for a suicide hotline for 6 months and then come back and we'll talk.
Siege in Washington, D.C. in 2003, on the eve of the Second Iraq War. The man that was there, his name was Dwight Watson. His family farm had been lost in a tobacco settlement, and Dwight had been protesting several years in a row on the National Mall and had gotten legal permits to protest on the National Mall, and nobody cared. So on St. Patrick's Day in 2003, he drove his tractor onto the National Mall and then into a pond, claimed to have scattered 4 bombs around the D.C. metropolitan area, and said he had 4 bombs with him. He found himself in the middle of this, and he didn't know how to find his way out emotionally because he had been in the 82nd Airborne and he wasn't about to surrender to anybody. So his vision was a grand vision for himself that he hadn't actually thought all the way through. We began talking with him, and he let slip that finally that if you're with the 82nd Airborne, if you parachuted behind enemy lines and you didn't get any reinforcements for 72 hours, 3 days, you could then withdraw with honor. So, of course, we weren't talking to him about surrendering, and then we knew we had to get him out of there with honor. The only problem at the time was Dwight was prone to fits of rage, and we still didn't know that he had whether or not he had bombs with him, and there was still technically a green light on him if he made a particular move in a particular direction. They were going to kill him, even though he agreed to come out in 2 days. But while we were talking with him, he would sprinkle biblical references in. Not really direct, but every now and then he would talk about something that let us know that his religion, something bigger than he was, that he believed in, larger than his own life that mattered to him, meant something to him. So we decided we wanted to get him out of the siege 24 hours earlier because we didn't want him to get killed accidentally. We called him on the phone one night after preparing and asked him if he was willing to come out the next day. And he said no. But then we said to him, well, Dwight, tomorrow is the dawn of the 3rd day. And he went dead silent, and we completely changed the objectives and how he saw himself and how he saw the situation. Of course, if he came out on the dawn of the 3rd day, which technically is only 48 hours, then he would be Christ-like in a way. And he stopped and he listened for a few seconds, and then he said, all right, I'll come out. So with an injection of an idea of taking him from being a member of the 82nd Airborne to maybe being Christ-like in his actions, I think we saved Dwight's life.
Provocative competence. Some of you may recall the Ken Burns series on jazz now 15 years ago. First Carnegie Hall Jazz Concert, 1938, Benny Goodman's band. Harry James is peeking out between the curtains, seeing everybody, I'm sorry, but better dressed, tuxedos, evening gowns, and so forth. Harry James says, I feel like a whore in church. And you hear the first thing they play, which is some Don't Be That Way. It's elevator music. There's no swing to it at all. So in the middle, Gene Krupa, you can see him on the left on drums, goes nuts and plays something that makes no musical sense at all. Phil Schaap, highly regarded critic, says he's not trying to wake up the crowd, he's trying to wake up the band. And I love this line, he's trying to relax them or scare them beyond their fear. So now, what does this mean in negotiation? George Mitchell also received one of our great negotiator awards. When he accepted, he said, you're giving me an award for failing for 729 days and succeeding on one. But even then, there was still bloodshed in Northern Ireland, and he went back time and time again. And he had a meeting where the Catholics are on one side of the table, the Protestants on the other, and here's what he said. Now, Hope, you would not do that on the first session, but I assume there are sometimes you have to get people's attention. You have to shake things up. And again, in the same way that Krupa did on the drums, Mitchell is doing here. Finally, in terms of jazz, minimum structure. Charles Mingus, got to improvise on something, on nothing, you got to improvise on something. Story told about a squad of Hungarian soldiers who were caught in a midsummer blizzard in Switzerland. They were training. This is in the 1930s. Their captain down in the valley had thought they'd be back on Tuesday. Wednesday comes, Thursday comes, no sign of them. Friday likewise. Saturday morning they appear. All of them have survived. They're starving, frostbitten and so forth, but every one of them made it. And after expressing his gratitude and congratulations, he asked, "How did you find your way down?" And one of them said, "Well, fortunately, we had a map, and as the snow was falling, we built a snow cave, huddled in, and when it abated, we looked around, made a guess about where we were, and worked our way down." The guy looks at the map, and it's a map of the Pyrenees. 1,000 kilometers from the Alps. But if we think about it, if they'd had a detailed map of Switzerland, they would have been arguing endlessly about where they were. If they'd had a map of the Sierra, of Lake Erie, let's say, they would have had no reason to hope. The map gave them confidence, impetus, they got going, and it made them learners. They were constantly calibrating what they thought they were seeing against what reality was. Let's turn to military doctrine. I almost called the book The Fog of Negotiation. Our daughter Kate said, "That's kind of a downer, Dad. People might kind of think you're losing it," right? But I want to talk about that and how the connection, I think, is 100%. Want to talk about marine practices and the OODA loop. This is from the current U.S. Marine Corps Warfighting Manual. All I've done is change the belligerent words. All actions in war, I say all actions in negotiation take place in an atmosphere of uncertainty. That is true. Uncertainty pervades negotiation in the form of unknowns about counterparts, about the environment, and so forth. The very nature of negotiation makes certainty impossible. All actions will have to be based on incomplete, inaccurate, or even contradictory information. Several weeks ago, Jeff Bezos said that you have to make decisions when you have 70% of the information you wish you had. If you wait for 100%, the train will have left the station. And that's true in negotiation. How many of you know this quotation? Plans are worthless. Plans are worthless. This is Dwight David Eisenhower, architect of the Normandy invasion, the greatest massing of troops and material in world history. Plans are worthless, he said. Planning is everything. You need to have something that you're testing your actions against. And he meant it because in his pocket, discovered a couple of weeks afterwards, is what he was going to say when we were turned back. So in spite of all of that planning, all of that preparation and so forth, he had a measure of humility that things may not turn out as you would think. So let's think about that in a negotiation context. Another person then in our dozen negotiation experts is Len Lira. I met him in Rome when he was on supposedly R&R. This is 2008 from Iraq. He was a major at that time. Fort Leavenworth, that's where all the strategy is developed for the Army. Very interesting guy, very sophisticated about negotiation. He's going to talk about ZOPA, the bargaining space, if you will, and BATNA, your non-agreement alternative. That's kind of our special jargon. Listen to his view about plans and planning.
So in the context of Iraq, one of our main issues was trying to establish these councils of reconciliation. In our particular area was that we had two different tribes, one from Sunni side and then one from the Shia side. It was not always evident to us what the conflict was. They had ongoing conflicts that predated the invasion because of the war had been unsurfaced. We didn't have that understanding. We understood that we had to initiate and try to be a third party to the negotiations and try to facilitate those negotiations. But it's not like what they teach you in the classroom where there's two sides to the story and there's a BATNA and you can understand that. Sometimes those interests they evolve depending on who is party to that negotiations, and understanding who are the people that should be involved in that negotiations is critical too. And what are their underlying motivations? Because as soon as you add somebody, you take somebody away from the table, it changes the entire dynamic. They always say in negotiation courses, preparation is key, because you have to understand everyone's perspective when they're coming to the table to negotiate. But another aspect is to understand that whatever you prepared for, you need to be prepared for additional information as it arises, because it's a give and take environment. When you are interacting in that type of environment, what you do, what other people do, changes the context. And so you have to always be evaluating it continuously as you go along.
The Marines are usually at the forefront in an encounter. They have very little time to plan. There are two watchwords. What's the most likely thing to happen? What's the most dangerous? Doesn't cover all the eventualities, but it makes you mindful of the downside. Negotiators should do the same thing. Here's a story of a failure to think in a dynamic kind of way, the failure to think of worst case scenario. This was in the Wall Street Journal some years ago. A co-op in Manhattan imposed a rule that said everybody had to put in window bars in their apartments. And most people complied, but a couple of owners said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't have children. We don't particularly like children. We don't invite people over to have children. If you want to put them in, board, you do it, but we're not paying. So what does the board do? The board says, we can't kind of give a bye to people. We'll hire a lawyer and send you a letter that says pay up. They do that. The guy doesn't, so we go to court. And the board wins, though it's a costly victory. Together they've now invested $15,000 almost in a $902 dispute. Anybody going to guess where we're going to get to this? Because there is an Act 3, and maybe go beyond that. There's an appeal that goes to the next level of court, and now the property owner wins, in quotes. They're bumping up on $30,000 combined. Of course, the board can't stand that, so they appeal. And their original victory is reinstated. But now we've invested $63,000, and I can't imagine that the atmosphere is very pleasant in that building. We're not done. The owner gave up, but then they started fighting about who had to pay. And there was a referee who said the owner had to pay a share of it. Combined bills came now to $100,000. That doesn't count the window bars on this. And I would say, with the advantage of distance, I wasn't there, that nobody on either side asked the question, might the other side be as stubborn and recalcitrant as we are? The Marine question, what's the worst that could happen? And you go down in this death spiral. There surely had to be people who owned other units there who could have slipped $902 in cash under the door, and they wouldn't have been subject to these assessments. But step by step, they walked down this chute. And I do think a more agile strategy might have saved them a lot of money. Again, I turn to Hopi. You see this on occasion, I assume. That's the result. And I think truly lose, 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 lose in terms of all the bystanders that suffered in this. co-ops lawyer, I love this. There were no surprises in this case. Hard for me to believe that the lawyer said, you know, this could cost you scores of thousands of dollars on this. No surprises. Well, the owner says, I learned my lesson. A pretty expensive lesson, I would say. John Boyd, we're still in the military thing of being adaptive. Boyd was a pain in the neck. He was a colonel in the Air Force and in conflict, in combat in Korea in the early 1950s. And later he became somebody at the Pentagon. He was, you know, enough of a pain that he never made general, but he's been very influential. He studied encounters between the Soviet Russian-built MiG-15 and the American F-86. The MiG-15 was more heavily armed, could fly faster, could fly higher, and the American plane won 90% of the encounters, even when the Russian plane was flown by Russian pilots. And the insight of Boyd was that the American plane had two advantages. One, a complete canopy so that the pilot had situational awareness. This is before modern day avionics. And it had, for its time, state-of-the-art hydraulics so it could climb, pitch, yaw, and so forth. And with every move, it could compound its advantage. So he came up with this notion of observe, look where you are, orient, and this is the hard part, compare what you're seeing with what you expected to see, identify mismatches, make a decision accordingly, act, and then see what happens next. And if you can do that faster than the other side, you prevail. In warfare, you're trying to disable the other party's ability to make good decisions. Not in negotiation necessarily. You want people to give you an informed yes. But you never want to be slower in this regard. And the problem is mismatch. I see we've got a couple of physicians here. I don't know, Rob, whether you know Jenny Rudolph at Mass General. She did an interesting study of young residents in anesthesiology. That's a robot in great distress, I might add. The premise is, this is a young woman who's had a burst appendix. She's carted into surgery. She's given whatever the standard general anesthesia is, and suddenly starts having seizures, heart's going nuts, and so forth. What do you do? Now, fortunately, we've got some people in the room. You'd know exactly what to do, Rob. George, too, but maybe not, because you're not anesthesiologists. But what she was interested in was how these young anesthesiologists in training would respond to the situation, because this robot has all of the vitals, all of the signs. You can watch what happens. 2 of the 39 in the sample did not know where to start. They didn't have any hypothesis. They couldn't make any sense of it. The robot dies. The next third, a dozen, came to a very plausible, likely diagnosis, only it was wrong. And they were making things worse. But because they were fixated on this, they didn't look at the evidence that they needed to do something different. Another group made the same initial diagnosis, saw that it wasn't working, jumped to something else. That didn't work, jumped to something else, but there was no rhyme or reason to their decision making. Those died. So now we're left with 10 in the pool, about 25%. These were adaptive learners. They learned from the prior experience of failing. They thought through, what would the signs be that our second guess isn't working as well? How long do we give it? And 7 of the 9 robots survived here. So maybe if there's time for some give and take at the end, I'm curious, as you think about medical diagnosis, how you have a hypothesis, but you don't let the hypothesis have you. Ideas, we need strong ideas. We're not just winging it. We need to have some expectations, and we need to be able to let them go. Lakhdar Brahimi, another one of our honorees, very interesting Algerian diplomat for the UN, talks about don't ask reality to conform to your blueprint, transform your blueprint to adapt to reality. So that's a theme I've been pushing here, and that's what's different about my take on negotiation. The idea is understanding it as a dynamic process where we're not looking at one negotiator, we're looking at the interaction between the two or more at the table. Let me give an example here. That's Betsy Brune, longest standing head of any of the Smithsonian art museums. Smithsonian museums. There are 19, including the famous Air and Space Museum, the zoo, and so forth. Hear her talk about a multi-level negotiation within her organization about acquiring that Liechtenstein.
And then we get lucky. So one time, a board member came and said, there is a 30-foot tall Liechtenstein sculpture that would look so great at your museum. I'll pay to bring it there, and then you can try to raise the money to buy it. My first thought was, gosh, bringing it there is going to be an incidental cost, and buying it is going to be a whopper. I took the idea to the curators, and they immediately saw that this was going to be a big number. It could obliterate all our acquisitions funds for 1, 2, or 3 years. They saw their own little opportunities drying up, because if we went for this giant big thing, there wouldn't be money for anything else. And so they rather universally came out against this idea. Meanwhile, I've got a board member who thinks I'm kind of crazy not for jumping at this. So we brought the sculpture here, we installed it. It looked amazingly phenomenal. We all loved it. But gosh, the price turned out to be $5 million. And my curators were frustrated. They could see, years of acquisition funds disappearing down a drain. So I went to the owner, a dealer, and I said, we love it, but we can't do $5 million, and I don't have any hope of raising $5 million for this piece, and I'm really sorry. We'd like to keep it on loan for a year, but we're not going to be able to buy it. He came back a month later and said, well, I've talked with my partners, and we're willing to offer it to you for $4 million. And I said, thank you so much. That's so gracious of you. However, I don't have $4 million either. And all this unfolds over a matter of weeks. He sooner or later comes back and says, well, what could you do? And I said, I probably have about $1 million I could put into it now. And if I work really hard and you give me terms, I might be able to come up with a second $1 million over 2 or 3 years. Now, in truth, I probably could have done more, but I knew I had a reluctant team. I didn't have much backup. I didn't really want to name a higher price and disappoint everyone. So I thought if I could get it for $2 million over a period of years, that might be good. He goes away, says, let me think about it. I'll talk to my partners. He comes back later and he said, I have a new price. And I said, okay. I'm thinking maybe he's going to come back with 3 or 3.5. He said, how about free? I said, free works. How do you get to free? He said, well, I had it appraised, and the appraisal came in not at $5 million, which is what I thought. It came in at $7.5 million. So I can just give it to you, and my tax deduction will be worth more than the money you were going to pay me. Problem solved. That was probably my favorite negotiation of all, was to get a $7.5 million sculpture for free.
So we've heard different voices. Betsy Brune in her position of being a veteran negotiator, Len Lira, Aaron, Chris Voss, and so forth. We can all learn, I think, from people far from our own fields. Now, she uses the word luck. There's a lot of luck in negotiation, whether the timing is right, whom we're dealing with, whether we can influence them to behave in a way that's constructive. But there's also skill in terms of reading the situation, understanding the people with whom you're dealing with, and where you can, changing the game in a positive way. Now, talk about knowing, doing, and being, self-awareness and feedback. I'm mindful of the time here, and if you can bear with me for 5 minutes, we're going to do a quick trip through the self-assessment that you just went through and take a look at it. So I asked you to do your best to allocate 16 points across these different issues in negotiation. Typically, with plenty of variation, people give themselves 4 points on the first two, creating value and asserting their interests. Maybe they flatter themselves in saying they're good at understanding where others are coming from. Most people are modest about what's piece of the pie they get. As I say, some people are more confident on certain items, others are less so. There's no right or wrong answer on this, but the vertical axis in the diagram to the right, if you were to plot out with each cell being 1 point, is the outcome dimension. And standard negotiation theory says it's hard to ride two horses at the same time. It's hard to chest your cards and try to be cute and create value, because if I don't know your interests and you don't know mine, we don't know where we can trade efficiently. I think that's an overstatement, but it's a widely held view that there's a tension or a dilemma there. Horizontally, there's the relational tension, and here again, I think it's in our heads, not in reality. I think you can be strong and assertive and make your case without being less than mindful and conscious of where other people are coming from. But many people who give themselves points on one of those feel that it comes out of the other's pocket. So you can take this home, draw a little matrix on this, and see what shape you get. Some people might be 4-4-4. There's nothing good necessarily about that. I rarely see it. We're not going to go to the app here just because of time, Steve. But I don't know where the N went in negotiation. But 30% of the people tilt towards creating value and empathy. And there's a logic there, right? If you think you're good at connecting with people, there ought to be some way to expand the pie. The reciprocal there is there are people who see themselves as getting a goodly or more than goodly piece of it, and they do it by asserting they don't think they're quite as good on the other 2 points. Here are people who are interesting. They think of themselves as assertive. They also think of themselves as creating value. I think these people may be, if you will, maximizers, where no matter how well they do, they think they could have done better. So they're shortchanging themselves and having second doubts about whether they got an absolutely world-beating deal. Some think their strengths are relational. You'd hope that would produce good outcomes in terms of the vertical axis, but that's not the way I see it. Others, maybe this is more the engineer mentality or focused on the problem solving more than the people. Now, there's nothing magical about this. What we want to be in the end is flexible. We want to be able to deploy those skills in a way that are appropriate to the situation that we encounter and the person with whom we're dealing. And I think it's possible. I know it's possible. So we're trying to find some way where we can identify what we're good at, where putting some effort in improvement would have the biggest payoff, and constantly be monitoring our experience, either with friends and colleagues, or being disciplined and keeping a journal, a diary of our negotiations, debriefing, after action review. It's done, I understand, in medicine as well, trying to learn from where we were smart or just lucky or where we would do things differently in the future. So there's another slide. If you're curious about another self-assessment thing, this is free. You can go to that site, and it asks you specifically what you do. Do you like to make the first offer? Do you care where you negotiate? And it will give you a profile as well, also on a very general basis. Finally, I have my own personal site that has some videos posted on it. I'm building something. It's in beta now, but it's accessible, the Negotiate 123, in conjunction with the Baker Library. I blog on negotiation on LinkedIn. Some of the stuff gets modest attention, some gets a very big readership. And then if you're really interested in negotiation and can spare $4.99, there's the app, and there's also, if you're curious to look at what an online course might be, that's there at the bottom. Well, I think I have gone over my allotted time. I think I was told I had 5 minutes, and we're over that. So some people may need to leave immediately. I won't be offended in the least. It's a lovely evening. I'm happy to linger and field any questions either from the floor, or if most people have to go, then just deal one-on-one. But thank you again, Jerry, for all that you do, not just for the library, but for your hometown of Gloucester. Thank you all for coming.